My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 30 years old, and on New Year's morning, I believed I was stepping into a fresh start. I had worked extra shifts just to make it to the family table wrapped gifts that carried memories and gratitude, and told myself maybe this year would feel different. But instead of an invitation, what I got was a phone call that would change everything. My mother's voice, careful and cold, told me this place isn't for losers. In that moment, the weight of years of being overlooked and dismissed came crashing down, and the house I once called home no longer had a seat for me. I thought the sting of rejection would be the hardest part, but what came after turned out to be far more shocking. Because sometimes the truth has a way of breaking through the prettiest illusions, and when it does, no amount of secrets or polished smiles can hold it back. Do you want to know what my family discovered when the curtain finally slipped? Stay with me, because this story will take you there. Let me take you back to where it began. On the first morning of the new year, I stood at the kitchen counter in my small house on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, carefully wrapping the scarf I had picked out for my mother. It was a soft gray wool, the kind I knew she would have liked if she gave herself the chance to wear something warm instead of just fashionable. Beside it sat a simple watch I had bought for my father, the back engraved with the words, "For Dad, thanks for teaching me to fix everything." My hands lingered on the box, imagining the moment I would hand it to him after dinner, his face surprised, maybe even proud for once. The phone rang before I could slip the watch into a gift bag. I wiped my hands on a towel and picked it up, still smiling. Mom's voice was on the other end, sweet and drawn out in a way that made the hair on my arms prickle. "Claire, honey, this year is a little different." She paused and my heart tightened. "Different how?" I asked. She hesitated, and then it came sharp and final. "This place isn't for losers." I froze. My boots were still by the door, ready for me to pull on before heading out. I held the phone so tight it creaked. She went on, her words slow, careful, like she was balancing on ice. "Your sister Emily is bringing Michael home today. He's very successful and she wants everything to go perfectly. You understand, right?" The words dropped like a hammer in my chest. She did not say I could not come, but she did not have to. I pictured Emily, 28, pretty and polished, with her new boyfriend who worked in venture capital, the one Mom kept bragging about to anyone who would listen. I pictured the dining room full of aunts and uncles, the table laid with roast ham and casseroles, the sound of laughter. And then I pictured myself, oil still stained under my nails, no matter how hard I scrub, hair tied back in a ponytail, boots heavy with grease. Out of place, unwanted. I could have told her I had worked 12-hour shifts all week to free this day. I could have told her about the scarf and the watch wrapped and waiting. I could have reminded her of the years I had helped Emily, the rent I had paid for her once, when she had nothing, the countless favors I never mentioned. But none of it came out. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the words fall out of me like smoke. "I understand." There was a silence so long I thought she had hung up. Then she gave a relieved little sigh and said, "Good. We'll see you another time." The line clicked dead. I stood in my small kitchen, phone in hand, the quiet pressing down on me. Outside, the sky was still gray from the fireworks the night before. The streets were empty except for the crunch of snowplows. It was New Year's Day, the one morning when the whole world seemed to pause, waiting for new beginnings. And mine began with being told I was not welcome. I set the phone down, slowly picked up the gift bag, and placed it on the table. The scarf and the watch looked almost embarrassed, sitting there like they knew they had no home to go to. I sat down across from them, staring, listening to the creak of the furnace. I could almost hear the echoes of past New Year's mornings. The clatter of dishes, Dad joking about resolutions he would never keep, Mom fussing about table settings, Emily twirling in a new dress. I used to believe that if I kept showing up, if I kept giving, they would one day see me. Today proved I had been wrong all along. My stomach growled, snapping me back. I got up, cracked 2 eggs into the skillet, dropped bread into the toaster. The smell of butter filled the kitchen, but it felt too quiet, like the air itself had been drained of warmth. I ate at the counter, staring at the snow outside, every bite heavy. After rinsing the dishes, I pulled on my jacket and boots. Sitting here with the silence pressing in was worse than working. Mrs. Halstead, my elderly neighbor 2 streets over, had left me a message the day before about her garage door opener acting up again. It was not urgent, but I needed something to do. I grabbed my toolbox and stepped into the biting cold. The streets of Columbus were empty, the stores shuttered for the holiday. My truck rattled over salted pavement heater, blowing warm air on my face. As I pulled up to Mrs. Halstead's modest house, she was already at the door, bundled in a cardigan, her thin face lighting up at the sight of me. Working on New Year's, she asked, gently handing me a mug of coffee before I could answer. I shrugged, better than sitting around doing nothing. She gave me a knowing look, but said nothing more. The garage opener was stubborn, but nothing I could not handle. 40 minutes later it whirred to life, the heavy door rolling up with a groan. She clapped her hands, delighted, then asked if I could help carry in firewood stacked by the shed. I did, the logs heavy in my arms, the air sharp in my lungs. Afterward, I replaced the batteries in her smoke detector, tightened a loose railing on her porch. When we sat down for a moment, she talked about her late husband, how he always carved the holiday roast too thick, how he loved to sneak cranberry sauce before anyone else sat down. I listened, sipping the coffee she had pressed into my hands, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. Before I left, she wrapped a slice of apple pie in foil and pushed it into my hands. In case you forget how good home can still taste, she said with a wink. Driving back, I passed my parents' street without meaning to. Their house glowed with golden light, the windows crowded with silhouettes raising glasses, the muffled sound of laughter carrying into the night. I slowed my heart, thudding the pie warm in my lap. For a moment I thought about pulling in, walking up the steps, opening the door. But I kept driving, the headlights carving a path through the cold dark. Back home I lit a fire in my small stove and sat by it with the pie. The crust was flaky, the filling sweet, the taste lingering on my tongue. It was not the pie I had grown up with, not the crowded table or the chorus of voices, but it was something. It was enough for tonight. The flames crackled the house, settling around me. I sat there a long time, letting the quiet wash over me, realizing that for the first time in years, I was not begging for a seat at a table. I was simply sitting at my own. And strangely, I did not feel lonely. I felt free. The next morning, I woke to the faint hum of the furnace and the pale light of winter slipping through the blinds. The quiet pressed in on me, heavier than the blanket pulled up around my shoulders. I lay there for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to summon a reason to get up. Eventually, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, my feet meeting the cold floor, and I pushed myself upright. In the kitchen, I cracked 2 eggs into a skillet, dropped bread into the toaster, and waited for the smell of butter to fill the air. The sizzle of eggs was the only sound. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small table. The scarf and watch still sat where I had left them, their neat wrapping, untouched, a reminder of what had been meant for yesterday. I ate slowly, the eggs cooling on my plate, thinking of the years when breakfast on New Year's morning meant chatter and clinking forks, Dad joking about resolutions, Emily snapping photos for social media, Mom fussing over napkins. Now it was just me, a plate, and silence. I rinsed the dishes and stared out the window at the snow piled on the sidewalks. I could not sit here all day. The air in the house felt too still, too thick with everything unsaid. I grabbed my jacket and boots, picked up my toolbox, and decided to check on Mrs. Halstead again. When I pulled up in front of her house, smoke was curling from her chimney. She opened the door before I even knocked, wrapped in a heavy sweater, her smile lighting her lined face. "You again?" she teased softly, as if she had been expecting me. I shrugged and lifted the toolbox. Figured I should check if the garage door is behaving. She laughed and stepped aside. The garage door whirred smoothly, no trouble at all, so I looked for something else that needed doing. Her kitchen faucet had a slow drip. The old porch railing sagged. I tightened bolts, fixed what I could move with the comfort of hands that knew their work. She trailed behind me, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching with quiet gratitude. After a while, she brewed coffee and set a plate of sugar cookies on the table. "Sit a minute," she said. I wiped my hands and joined her. She told me about the first New Year's she had spent in this house decades ago, when her husband was alive and their children were still young. The house had been loud, then filled with laughter and arguments over board games. Now the rooms were quiet except for the ticking of a clock and the faint hum of her heater. I listened, sipping the coffee, feeling the warmth seep through me. She said she missed the noise most of all, the kind that used to annoy her when she was tired. "Funny how silence can cut deeper than sound," she mused. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. Before I left, she pressed a plastic container into my hands with leftover stew inside. "Heat it up for dinner," she said, and I thanked her, my throat tight. Driving back through the neighborhood, I found myself slowing as I reached my parents' street. Their house stood out, even in the daylight, holiday lights still blinking from the night before, cars crowding the driveway. Through the window, I caught glimpses of movement, figures, clearing dishes, laughter, carrying faintly into the cold air. My chest tightened. I pulled over for just a second, engine idling, fingers gripping the steering wheel. I could have walked up the familiar path, knocked on the door, acted as though nothing had happened. They might have let me in, sat me at the corner of the table, offered me leftovers. But the thought twisted in my stomach. Yesterday, Mom's voice had been so firm, so certain that my presence would ruin their perfect picture. No amount of food or small talk could scrub that away. I shifted the truck back into gear and kept driving. The road stretched ahead, lined with bare trees, and the occasional wreath left hanging on a porch. My phone buzzed once on the seat beside me, but I did not reach for it. Back home, I set the stew in the fridge and lit the small fire in the stove again. The flames caught quickly, crackling into life, and I sat close, letting the warmth soak through my jeans. I thought of Mrs. Halstead's words about missing the noise, how silence had become sharper with time. I thought of the laughter spilling from the Dawson house just blocks away, and of how easily they had erased me from the picture. The clock ticked toward afternoon, the light outside fading into that pale winter dusk. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the fire settle the house creak as it warmed. For the first time, I let myself stop pretending. They had drawn the line and I had stepped back. The quiet felt less like emptiness now, and more like space, wide and uncertain but mine to claim. When I was a kid, I used to sneak into the garage whenever Dad wasn't looking, just to run my hands over the wrenches and screwdrivers lined neatly in his red toolbox. I loved the smell of oil and rubber, the way metal clicked against metal. At 8 years old, I was small enough to sit cross-legged under his workbench, imagining I was fixing something important. Mom would find me with grease on my shirt and sigh like I was tracking mud through a white carpet. Emily never got scolded for messes like that. Emily was 2 years younger, all curls and dimples, the kind of child who made adults smile without even trying. She twirled in tutus for dance recitals, sang in the school choir, gave speeches at assemblies. Mom kept every program, every ribbon. Our fridge was covered with Emily's achievements. My science fair projects, the ones I built out of old motors and wires, never made the cut. I remember one Saturday when Dad came home with a camera. Emily stood on the front porch in her sparkly leotard, posing with her arms in the air. I was kneeling in the yard beside an old lawnmower I had managed to take apart. I asked him to take a picture of me too. He lifted the camera, hesitated, and then lowered it again. "Claire," he said, "you don't want to be photographed looking like that." I felt the sting of those words more sharply than any scraped knuckle. In high school, the divide grew wider. Emily glided through with perfect hair and student government badges. I spent afternoons in the auto shop, crawling under cars with a flashlight clenched in my teeth. When senior prom came, Emily rented a white limo with her friends. I was in the driveway with a socket wrench, replacing brake pads on an old Chevy. Mom took pictures of Emily in her satin gown, clapping as the limo drove away. She barely noticed me wiping sweat from my forehead. One evening at dinner, I told them I wanted to apply to the trade program at Columbus Technical. Mom's fork clattered against her plate. "Trade school," she repeated, her mouth twisting like I had just announced I was joining the circus. "You're too smart for that. Why not something respectable? Dad didn't look up from his newspaper. He muttered, "Is that really safe for a girl?" Emily snickered, her chin propped on her hand. I ate the rest of my meal in silence, swallowing each bite like gravel. There were moments when I tried to bridge the gap. On Mother's Day, I saved up for bouquets of lilies, even though Mom always said she preferred roses. On Father's Day, I mowed the lawn and fixed the squeaky hinges without being asked. None of it seemed to matter. What they celebrated was Emily on the morning news during her short stint as a local reporter, her smile beaming from the screen. They replayed her clips at every family gathering, passing the laptop around like she was a celebrity. When my first job came through at the trucking depot, I told Dad proudly that I had been hired as a junior mechanic. He didn't say congratulations. He just asked if I had health insurance and if I thought I could handle the hours. He never once came to see the shop. Mom never asked what I worked on, what problems I solved. The word respectable followed me everywhere. Respectable jobs, respectable clothes, respectable friends. It was their code for polished and presentable, the opposite of grease under my nails and flannel shirts with sleeves rolled up. I learned early that no matter how much I did for them, I was not the daughter they wanted. Emily was. She was their golden child, their polished reflection. I was the one they kept in the shadows, useful when things broke, invisible the rest of the time. I still tried, though. I remember one winter when Emily's apartment pipes burst and she couldn't pay rent. She called me crying. Without hesitation, I wired her $1,000. She never mentioned it again, not even a thank you, and I never brought it up. It wasn't just them. Teachers treated Emily like a rising star and me like a distraction. At Thanksgiving dinners, relatives asked her about her latest internships and barely glanced my way. By the time I turned 20, I had accepted it, though it still stung. I was family by birth, not by belonging. Lying back in my chair that winter afternoon years later, the fire crackling in my stove, I let those memories surface like old bruises. Each one explained why Mom's voice on the phone yesterday had landed so heavily. She had not simply said I could not come. She had confirmed what I had known since childhood. To them, I had never truly been enough. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle. The scarf on the table, the watch, the gifts meant to say I remember and I care sat unopened. They were echoes of the child I once was, still chasing a sliver of approval. I felt the heat from the stove brush against my face, reminding me that I no longer had to chase. Outside, the snow fell heavier, tapping softly against the window. I rose to check the lock on the back door, then stood there for a moment, staring out into the gray sky. The house creaked, the clock ticked, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to see my family clearly without excuses. It was not anger that filled me. It was something colder, quieter, a recognition carved deep. They had chosen who belonged at their table and who did not. And I had chosen to stop knocking. In 2013, I was 22 years old and working long shifts at a trucking depot on the south side of Columbus. My paycheck barely covered rent for a cramped apartment with peeling paint, and some weeks I skipped dinner just to keep the lights on. At night, I came home smelling like diesel, my hands raw from cold metal. Still, there was a strange comfort in knowing how machines fit together when people in my life never seemed to. One evening, I was bent over the hood of an old Freightliner when the shop radio played a late-night finance show. The host was talking about compound interest and index funds, words I barely understood, but something about the way he described money working while you slept caught my attention. I went home that night with the idea stuck in my head. A week later, I walked into the public library and pulled a book off the shelf called The Simple Path to Wealth. I devoured it in 2 days. Then I read another and another until the words stopped sounding foreign. I opened my first brokerage account with $700, nearly everything I had. That winter, I skipped buying new boots and put $300 more into a Vanguard fund instead. It felt like planting a seed in frozen ground, tiny and invisible but alive. Each month, I forced myself to add a little more. When friends bought new phones or nights out, I picked up side jobs, patching roofs or changing brakes on weekends, funneling the extra cash into investments. At first, no one noticed. My coworkers spent their paychecks on trucks and hunting gear, shaking their heads when I packed peanut butter sandwiches for lunch. Even Jasmine, my best friend since high school, thought I was being too strict with myself. She would hold up a sweater in a store window and say, "You deserve to buy something nice for once." I would smile but keep walking. What I deserved was freedom. Years went by. The depot promoted me to shift manager, and suddenly I had 7 guys looking to me for schedules and decisions. I kept crawling under rigs myself, refusing to let go of the work that had shaped me. At home, I tracked every dividend, every reinvested dollar. I printed out spreadsheets and taped them inside my closet door, a secret tally no one else could see. In 2018, I bought my first house, a rundown 2-bedroom on the east side of town. The roof leaked, the furnace rattled, the pipes groaned whenever I turned on the tap. But the mortgage was mine, and the keys jingled in my pocket like proof. I spent weekends tearing up carpet, sanding floors, fixing what contractors would have charged thousands to do. Every dollar saved went back into my portfolio. I painted the walls myself, patched drywall until my arms ached, and when I finally lit the stove that first winter, the heat felt earned in a way nothing else had. I never told my parents. Not about the account, not about the house. Part of me longed to, but I knew how it would go. They would smile politely, maybe even nod, but it would never compete with Emily's latest highlight. So I stayed quiet, protecting what I had built like a secret engine humming under the hood. By 2020, my investments had grown to $500,000. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late at night, the glow of my laptop on my face, staring at numbers that once seemed impossible. Outside, the world was quiet, sirens, distant on empty streets, but inside I felt something bloom. I was not wealthy by the standards my family cared about, but I was secure, and that was enough. The pandemic hit hard that year. Work slowed, layoffs circled the depot, and neighbors whispered about bills they could not pay. I kept my head down, worked overtime when I could, and watched my dividends keep dripping in like a steady heartbeat. When a friend called in tears after losing her job, I sent groceries to her porch without saying a word. I remembered too clearly what it felt like to go hungry. By 2022, I had added a rental property, a small duplex near campus, the kind of place students filled every fall. It was not glamorous, but the rent checks came steady. I fixed leaky sinks and repainted walls myself, never hiring out what my own 2 hands could do. Each improvement was another brick in the wall. I was building a barrier between me and the shame of not being enough. One night that year, I sat with Jasmine on my porch. She leaned back in a chair, sipping coffee, looking at the apple tree I had planted in the yard. "You ever think about telling them?" she asked gently. "About all this?" I shook my head. "If they did not respect me when I was just a mechanic, they do not deserve to respect me for this." She studied me for a long time, then nodded. "I guess that makes sense." I wanted to believe it was pride, but deep down I knew it was protection. The second the numbers came out, everything would shift. I would stop being Claire the sister, who worked with her hands, and become Claire the bank account. I was not ready to be loved for a balance sheet. That winter, I stood in the driveway, beside my old pickup odometer, reading 230,000 miles. The paint was dull, the seat torn, but it ran without complaint. I leaned against the hood, breathing in the crisp night air, and realized something. I had been chasing approval my whole life, but what I had built did not need anyone else's permission. I looked up at the cold Ohio sky, stars faint against the city glow, and promised myself I would keep building. Not for them. For me. People in town never seemed to know what to make of me. At the depot, I was just another mechanic with grease under my fingernails, but out in the neighborhood I could feel eyes linger. Moms at the grocery store looked at my boots. The cashier glanced at my calloused hands, and I could hear the unspoken judgment. It was not ladylike work, not the sort of career they bragged about at church gatherings. The worst was Tom Briggs. He owned a shop a few miles away, smaller than ours, but loud in the way he talked about himself. He liked to swagger around in crisp shirt rings on his fingers, always quick with a jab when he saw me. Once at the parts supplier, he chuckled in front of the counter guy and said, "Looks like you have your hands full, Claire." Customers must get nervous seeing a woman crawl under their truck. I forced a smile, signed my receipt, and walked out without giving him the satisfaction of a reply. Inside, though, my chest burned. Even some of the truckers who came to our depot hesitated when they realized I would be the one repairing their rigs. One man stared at me, arms crossed, and muttered I asked for a mechanic, not a secretary. I tightened my jaw, picked up my wrench, and slid under his truck without a word. 2 hours later, it was running smoother than it had in years. He did not apologize, but the next time he needed work, he asked for me by name. That small victory kept me going. It was not just strangers. At family gatherings, before they started excluding me, relatives whispered about Emily's work in public relations, her short stint on TV, her polished smile. Then someone would ask me, "So, are you still at that garage like it was a summer job I should have grown out of?" I would nod and swallow my pride with the mashed potatoes. Jasmine was one of the few who never looked down on me. She would swing by the depot on her way home from school, hair pulled back, papers stacked in her arms. "You smell like a carburetor," she would joke, handing me a soda. I would grin and reply, "Better than perfume." She laughed because she knew I meant it. With her, I never had to explain myself. By 2020, while others were buying new trucks and flashy tools, I was watching my account creep toward $500,000. I kept it to myself. Tom bragged about his business, expanding about the new lift he had installed, and sneered when he saw me still driving my old pickup. He had no idea I was quietly buying shares in the very freight companies that kept his lights on. I preferred it that way. Sometimes at night I wondered if keeping it secret made me a coward. But then I thought about the look on Dad's face when I once tried to tell him about a promotion. He had only asked if it paid enough to move me out of that neighborhood. His silence was worse than an insult. It made me realize nothing I accomplished in their eyes would be the right thing. So, I kept my victories private. There were still nights when doubt crept in. I would lie awake, hearing the wind rattle the windows of my little house, thinking, maybe they are right. Maybe I chose the wrong path. The next morning, I pulled on my coveralls, smelled the motor oil, and remembered why I loved it. Machines never cared who you were. They only responded to steady hands and knowledge. One afternoon, Tom showed up at the depot, strutting in like he owned the place. He leaned against the counter, eyeing me. "Heard you are still patching up junkers, Claire. Guess some people are content staying small." I wanted to tell him about the duplex I had just bought, about the dividends that arrived in my account without me lifting a finger, about the freedom I was building. Instead, I tightened my ponytail and asked, "What do you need fixed?" He scowled, muttered something, and left. That night, I opened my laptop, pulled up my account, and watched the numbers glow back at me. 500,000, the kind of number I never thought I would see next to my name. I stared at it for a long time, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Out there, people could laugh, they could dismiss me. But here, in this quiet room, I knew the truth. I closed the computer and leaned back, breathing in the scent of sawdust from the repairs I had done that week on the porch railing. My house was far from perfect, but it was mine. My future was mine, and no one could take that away from me. Emily moved back into our parents' house not long after her short career on local television fell apart. I heard about it through a cousin before Mom mentioned it, as if admitting it directly would tarnish the shine she still saw in her youngest daughter. The story was simple enough. Emily had landed a job with a station in Cleveland, full of promise and lights and makeup chairs. But within a year, her contract wasn't renewed. She packed her things, drove back to Columbus, and slid right back into the Dawson home like nothing had changed. Mom was thrilled to have her there again. I knew it from the way her voice brightened whenever she talked about Emily. She said things like, "It is so nice to have her around," or "She brings life to the house." No one ever said that about me. Emily didn't just return quietly either. Almost immediately, she had a new boyfriend, Michael Reed, and he was everything Mom had prayed for. Harvard graduate, venture capital, polished shoes, pressed shirts, perfect smile. Every time she brought his name up, her tone lifted, proud and smug. I could hear it even when she left voicemails, her voice almost singing. One Sunday in late summer, Jasmine and I were grabbing coffee downtown when Mom called. Her voice was bubbling over. "You will not believe who Emily is dating," she said, stretching every syllable like taffy. "His name is Michael. Such a gentleman, works in venture capital. Harvard, Claire. Harvard." I stared at my coffee cup, letting the heat seep into my hands, and murmured, "That is nice, Mom." I did not tell her my stomach had tightened. By Thanksgiving that year, every conversation I overheard in the family group chat was about Emily and Michael. Pictures of them at pumpkin patches, at football games, at dinners where the table was crowded with wine glasses. I never added a word. The shift in my parents was obvious the next time I visited. I had stopped by to drop off a replacement part Dad needed for the lawnmower. Emily came gliding down the stairs in a fitted blazer, her hair done, and Mom lit up like a Christmas tree. "Claire is here," she called, but her eyes never left Emily. She asked how Emily's job hunt was going, how Michael was settling into his new project. When I started to mention the shop or the duplex I was fixing, the conversation drifted away like smoke. Dad sat in his chair, nodding along, and at one point he said, "You know, if this thing with Michael works out, our family could really step up in the world." The way he said it made it sound like Emily's relationship was a collective achievement, something all of them would share pride in. My work, my nights under rigs, my spreadsheets full of numbers no one knew about, meant nothing in comparison. Later that week, I ran into Emily by chance at the grocery store. She was pushing a cart full of wine and cheeses, dressed like she was heading to a cocktail party. She stopped in front of me, smile sharp, and said, "Michael is coming over for dinner again. Mom is cooking her pot roast, you know, the one she saves for special occasions." Her eyes flicked to the grease stains on my sleeve. "Maybe you should come by another time." I swallowed the sting and nodded. "Sure, another time." By December, the family was buzzing with talk of a New Year's dinner that would outshine anything before. Mom had plans for new table linens, Dad was stringing lights across the porch. Emily was coordinating a menu like she was hosting a gala. Every time I overheard their chatter, it was clear. This was not just a holiday meal. It was Emily's stage, and Michael was the star guest. One evening, as I was closing the shop, Tom Briggs came by for parts. He leaned on the counter smirking and said, "Heard your sister snagged herself a fancy man. Bet your folks are over the moon." I kept my voice steady as I replied, "Just here to buy or just here to talk?" He laughed and walked out, leaving me grinding my teeth. At home that night, I opened my laptop, checked my accounts, and forced myself to breathe. Numbers don't lie, I reminded myself. They don't care about last names or polished shoes. Still, when I closed it, the silence in the house felt heavier than ever. On Christmas Eve, I dropped off a tin of cookies at my parents' door. Mom barely looked at me before rushing back to stir something on the stove. Emily was in the living room, arranging candles, humming to herself, her phone buzzing with messages. I stood there for a moment, cookies in my hands, invisible. Then, I set them on the counter and left without saying goodbye. As the new year approached, I could feel the gap widening. The family was preparing for a celebration. I had no part in their voices, full of excitement, mine unheard. Each day the truth sank deeper. They were building a world where Emily shone. Michael sparkled, and I was nothing more than background noise. The morning after Christmas, I woke to another message from Mom, her tone brisk. "Don't forget, Claire, we are keeping New Year's Day small this year. Emily wants it perfect." I stared at the phone, the words sharp and cold. Small meant without me. I set the phone down, my hands trembling, and walked to the window. Snow was falling again, thick and steady, covering everything in white. For a moment I pressed my forehead to the glass, breathing slowly, letting the cold seep into me. They had drawn the lines clear. Emily and Michael in the center, shining. Me left outside in the cold. And the year had not even begun yet. It was a week before New Year's when I finally put the name together with the face. I had been under the hood of a Peterbilt Knuckles scraped when one of the younger techs mentioned how much he hated his first job. He laughed, saying he almost got fired the day he wrecked an axle until someone vouched for him. Then he said the name Michael Reed, and the sound jolted me like a wrench dropped on concrete. I wiped my hands and leaned against the workbench, the smell of oil sharp in my nose. Michael Reed. I knew that name because I had been the one who vouched for him. Years earlier, before Harvard, before his polished shoes and perfect smile, he was just a nervous college kid trying to make it through a summer at the shop. I remembered the first day he walked in, skinny arms, unsure eyes, fumbling with a torque wrench like it was foreign. The foreman wanted to fire him after a mistake that cost hours of labor, but I had stepped in. "Give him another shot," I said. "I will train him." For weeks he followed me around, scribbling notes, asking questions that slowed me down but showed he cared. He stayed late to watch me rebuild an engine, his eyes wide, and I told him things no one had ever told me. How to tell by sound when a motor was running rough. How to keep records, track parts, never guess at a repair. He once dropped a differential and nearly crushed his foot. I had grabbed his arm just in time, yelling in his face, until he nodded he understood. By the end of that summer, he had improved enough that the foreman stopped talking about firing him. When he left for school, he shook my hand with both of his and said he owed me. I had shrugged it off, never expecting to see him again. Now, years later, he was in my parents' living room dating Emily, the golden boy they were desperate to show off. My chest tightened as I thought about it. Did he tell her about the shop, about me? Did he mention the long nights and my warnings, and how close he came to walking away from the trade entirely? Or did he erase all of it, smoothing his story until it shone the way Emily needed it to? That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the memory of him struggling with an air gun that kept slipping in his hands. He had looked so young, so uncertain, and I had been the one steady enough to guide him. Now my family looked at me with pity, and looked at him like salvation. The next day, I drove past my parents' house. Through the window, I saw Emily and Michael at the table, her hand resting on his, my mother's face glowing as if Christmas had not yet ended. I pulled over for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I thought about walking in, about saying his name, reminding him in front of everyone exactly who I was to his story. But I did not move. I sat there with the engine idling until the cold seeped through my coat, then I drove away. A few days later, I ran into Emily at the mall while I was picking up new work gloves. She was holding shopping bags, her perfume clouding the air around her. Michael appeared at her side, carrying more bags, his coat sharp, his hair perfectly in place. When his eyes landed on me, I saw a flicker, a flash of recognition he quickly buried under a smooth smile. Emily turned, chattering, and he placed a hand on her back. Our eyes met again for a split second, and I knew he remembered. He just wasn't going to say it. I walked away before Emily could speak, the sound of their laughter following me down the corridor. My throat ached, but I kept moving, clutching the gloves like they were something solid in a world that wanted to erase me. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my ledger open, the numbers neat in their rows. I told myself this was what mattered, not their show, not their polished dinner table. I thought of the way Michael had looked at me, how quickly he had hidden his past, and the truth pressed heavy on my chest. In the garage, I pulled the cover off an engine I had been working on, let the weight of the metal ground me. My hands moved with memory, each bolt familiar, each sound reassuring. Machines never lied about what they were. They broke, they rusted, they fought back, but they never pretended. The wind rattled against the garage door, and for a moment I closed my eyes. I could see Emily lifting her glass, my mother beaming, Michael sitting at the head of the table as if he had been born to it, and in that vision I saw the crack, the truth no one there wanted to acknowledge. They thought Michael was proof of their success. I knew better, and sooner or later so would they. On the 3rd day of January, the Dawsons held their grand New Year's dinner, the one Mom had been planning for weeks. I knew the time because the neighborhood group chat was full of chatter about cars parked all up and down the block, and one of my cousins texted a picture of the table spread. From my little house across town, I imagined it clearly. The dining room draped in new linens candles, glowing Emily sitting next to Michael, her hand resting on his sleeve, while my parents watched him like he was the future they had always wanted. I had no seat there, no invitation, but that did not stop the ache in my chest as I thought about it. I busied myself in the garage that night, changing the brake pads on a delivery van, but my mind kept drifting back to that house filled with voices I used to know. Later I learned exactly what happened, though not from Mom or Dad. It came from a cousin who called me the next morning, her voice still buzzing with the shock of it. She said the evening had been rolling along like a pageant. Emily introduced Michael to every relative, her smile wide, her laugh too bright. Mom hovered near the kitchen, but never far from his side, pouring wine as if he were a visiting dignitary. Dad sat taller than usual, pride radiating from him, telling stories that made our family sound more important than we ever were. Then one of the uncles, half a glass too deep, leaned back in his chair and asked Michael how he had gotten his start. Everyone turned toward him, forks, pausing, waiting for some polished answer about Harvard or his first big deal. Instead, Michael chuckled and said, "If I am being honest, I wouldn't have made it without Claire Dawson." The silence was instant. Forks clinked against plates. Emily's smile froze on her face. Mom's eyes darted toward the table as if she hadn't heard him right. Michael went on. "Years ago, I was just a kid who had no idea how to hold a wrench," he told them. "Claire kept me from getting fired. She taught me everything about engines, about patience, about not giving up. Without her, I would not even have had the confidence to keep going." Emily sputtered, trying to laugh it off, but Michael didn't stop. He mentioned the spreadsheets I had shown him back then, the difference between gambling on trends and building real wealth. He told them I had been the one to show him what it looked like to take control of money, that I had explained things he had never learned at school. "My cousin," said Mom's face drained of color. Dad rubbed his temple, and Emily snapped at Michael, asking why he felt the need to embarrass her. "Embarrass you," he said, sounding confused. "I was giving credit where it belongs." The rest of the night limped along, but the shine was gone. Emily's laugh sounded forced. Mom's hands shook as she carried dessert, and Dad barely spoke. Relatives whispered to one another, glancing around as if a curtain had been pulled back, and none of them knew how to react. When my cousin finished telling me all this, I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the details like they were part of someone else's life. I imagined the stunned faces, the way Emily must have looked at Michael, like he had betrayed her, and the way my parents must have realized that the person they had pushed outside was the very reason their perfect guest had become who he was. I thanked my cousin for telling me, and when I hung up, I stayed there in the quiet, staring at the floor. My heart thudded heavy, not from joy exactly, but from something sharper. Vindication. That evening, I lit a fire in the stove and sat close, letting the crackle of wood fill the silence. I thought about Michael's voice, steady and clear, naming me in front of all of them. They had worked so hard to erase me from their picture, and yet my name had been spoken right in the center of their celebration. The pie Mrs. Halstead had given me days before still sat wrapped in foil in the fridge. I pulled it out, cut a slice, and ate it slowly by the fire. Each bite was warm and sweet, grounding me. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the streets quiet and white under the streetlights. I leaned back in my chair, holding the empty plate, and let myself breathe. I didn't need to be in that room to know the truth had landed. And the truth had a way of lingering, long after the candles burned out. 3 days after the dinner, I was in my garage tightening the bolts on a flatbed truck when I heard tires crunching in the snow outside. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out, the cold air hitting my face. Parked in the driveway was my parents' sedan, and behind it Emily's car. My stomach dropped as I saw the three of them climb out, bundled in coats, looking like they had rehearsed the moment. Mom carried a tin wrapped in foil, the kind she usually brought to potlucks. Her smile was too wide, her eyes searching. Dad stood stiff, his hands deep in his pockets, rocking on his heels. Emily crossed her arms tight against her chest, her face red, not from the cold, but from something simmering inside her. Claire, Mom called out, her voice sugary sweet. "We thought we'd stop by and check on you." I leaned against the garage door frame, crossing my arms. "Check on me," I said flatly. After deciding I wasn't welcome at dinner, the smile faltered on her face. She shifted the tin from one hand to the other. "Things got complicated, honey." Emily cut in, her voice sharp. "You should have told me." I blinked. "Told you what? That Michael worked for you," she snapped. "That you were the one who trained him, that you practically built his career." I stayed quiet, watching her cheeks flush deeper. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it was?" she said, raising her voice, "when he sat there in front of the whole family and gave you credit? Everyone was looking at me like I was the fool." Dad cleared his throat, trying to calm her, but she wasn't finished. "And then he brought up your money," she said, glaring at me. "He said you have investments, that you taught him about finance, that you've built a fortune." She jabbed a finger in my direction. "You let me walk around thinking you were scraping by while you sat on all that." I straightened. "I never hid anything from you, Emily. You just never asked." Mom finally spoke, her tone soft, pleading. "We had no idea, Claire. We didn't know how much you had accomplished." I looked at her, then at Dad. "Would it have mattered?" I asked. "Would I have been invited if Michael hadn't said something?" Silence. Dad looked at the ground, his breath a cloud in the cold air. Mom took a step forward, holding out the tin like it was a peace offering. "We came to apologize," she said carefully. "And to talk." I raised an eyebrow. "Talk about what?" She glanced at Emily, then back at me. "Michael is starting a new business. Auto parts distribution. He thinks you two should meet again, maybe work together, combine your strengths." There it was, the real reason. Not guilt, not love, opportunity. I let out a dry laugh and pushed away from the doorframe. "You came here to apologize, but what you really brought was a pitch." Emily's eyes hardened. "It's called building something, Claire. You should understand that." I met her gaze. "I do. That's why I built it without you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mom opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Dad shifted uncomfortably, the crunch of snow under his boots breaking the silence. I stepped back toward the garage, the smell of oil and metal wrapping around me like armor. "You made it clear what table I was allowed to sit at," I said. "Now you don't get to pull up a chair at mine." Their faces froze, Emily's with fury, Mom's with hurt, Dad's with quiet resignation. I turned and walked inside, leaving the door half closed behind me. The cold seeped in for a moment. Then I shut it gently, not with anger, but with finality. From the window I watched them linger on the driveway, uncertain, shuffling their feet. Finally they turned, climbing back into their cars. The engines roared to life, headlights cutting through the dusk, and then they were gone. I stood there in the stillness, the rag still in my hand, my heart beating steady. The cranberry muffins in Mom's tin sat untouched on the porch. The garage smelled of grease and exhaust. For the first time in years, I felt the weight shifting. They had come to me, and not out of love, out of need. And I had closed the door. A week later, an envelope showed up in my mailbox with my parents' return address on the corner. I almost tossed it onto the counter, without opening it, expecting some belated card or another attempt at smoothing things over, but the weight of the papers inside made me pause. When I slid them out, I saw copies of a quitclaim deed, signatures scrawled at the bottom, transferring the family house into Emily's name. For a long moment, I just stared at the pages, my pulse quickening. The house on Linden Avenue was the only real asset my parents had. I had helped pay property taxes one rough winter years ago when Dad was short. I had fixed the furnace, patched leaks, even covered a mortgage payment once when foreclosure threatened. And now, without a word, they had signed it all away. I folded the papers back into the envelope and sat at the kitchen table, the clock ticking loudly on the wall. My chest felt tight, not from surprise but from recognition. It confirmed what I had always suspected. Emily was not just the golden child in their eyes, she was the heir to everything. That evening I called Jasmine. She came over with a box of takeout and sat across from me as I laid the papers out on the table. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned them. "Claire," she said slowly, "this is serious. They didn't just put her name on the deed, they stripped themselves out of it entirely. I nodded, my throat dry. What should I do? You need legal advice, she said firmly. Don't go charging into their house demanding answers. Find out where you stand. The next morning, I drove downtown to a brick building with a brass plaque that read Carter and Wells. I had heard of Samuel Carter from a trucker who swore the man saved his business during a messy divorce. Carter was in his mid-50s, silver hair, calm eyes that made you feel like he had seen every trick in the book. He listened as I explained, nodding occasionally, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I finished, he tapped the papers. You're not on this deed, he said, which means legally, you don't have a claim to the property as it stands. I felt heat rise in my face, but I supported them. I paid into that house when they couldn't. Doesn't that matter? It matters morally, he said gently, but not in the eyes of the law unless you have written agreements or canceled checks specifically tied to ownership. Do you? I shook my head. Most of what I gave was cash wired or paid directly on their behalf. He leaned back in his chair. Then you need to protect yourself another way. Stop mixing your finances with theirs. Make sure your investments are separate and airtight. If they come to you for money again, get everything in writing. I swallowed, trying to steady myself. So there's nothing I can do about the house. Not directly, he said. But you can decide how you respond when they come knocking. And they will. The words landed with a cold certainty. I drove home through the snowy street's headlights, reflecting off the drifts, Carter's advice circling in my head. Protect yourself. Stop mixing. Get it in writing. For years I had given without question, believing that family meant trust. Now I realized family had used that trust like currency. That night, I sat at my desk with a stack of old receipts and bank statements tracing the money I had funneled into their crises. $800 for a furnace repair, $2,000 toward Emily's rent, one mortgage payment of $1,400. None of it protected, none of it acknowledged. Just pieces of myself given away. The bitterness tasted sharp, but underneath it was something steadier. Resolve. A few days later, Dad called. His voice was measured, almost casual. Claire, the water heater's gone out. Emily's been looking into replacements, but it's pricey. I took a deep breath, Carter's words echoing. Send me the invoice, Dad. I'll look it over. There was a pause on the line. Well, we were hoping you could just take care of it. I shook my head, though he couldn't see it, not without paperwork. If you want my help, it needs to be in writing. The silence stretched. Then he muttered, Fine, we'll figure it out. The line went dead. I sat back, heart pounding, but a strange calm settled over me. For once I had drawn the boundary. That evening I pulled the deed copies out again, studying Emily's name where mine had never been. It stung, but the sting was fading into clarity. They had chosen their heir. I would choose my future. I slipped the papers into a folder marked legal and locked it in my desk. The snow outside thickened, muffling the world, as if everything was holding its breath. For the first time, I was no longer asking how to earn a place in their house. I was asking how to protect my own. January dragged into February with gray skies and a bitter wind that cut through every coat I owned. Work at the shop kept me busy, but the quiet hours at home seemed to stretch longer. I had not heard from Emily since the night they showed up in my driveway, and honestly, I preferred it that way. Still, part of me knew silence never lasted long in our family. The first crack came when a mutual friend mentioned that Michael had stepped away from the new business venture he had been talking up. Something about disagreements with investors, a deal falling through. Within a week, Emily's posts online changed from glamorous snapshots to vague quotes about resilience. I didn't comment. I didn't call. I just kept my head down, turning wrenches, clocking hours, watching snow pile against the garage door. Then Tom Briggs showed up at the depot one Friday afternoon, his voice too loud for the small waiting area. He looked worn, not the cocky man who once smirked at my coveralls. He tugged at his collar, cleared his throat, and asked if I could look over a contract he had for a municipal fleet. Said the city wanted more documentation than he had and he was running out of time. I wiped my hands on a rag and stared at him. Why are you asking me? He shifted his weight, glancing at the other guys in the shop. Because you know this stuff, Claire. I heard you've been investing, building things you're good with paperwork. It was almost laughable. The same man who had once said no one would trust a woman with a semi-engine was standing in front of me, eyes desperate. I folded my arms and said calmly, I can't help you, Tom. He stammered, offering a percentage if I could just guide him through, but I shook my head. I'm too busy keeping my own work running. You'll figure it out. He left, shoulders slumped, and I felt no guilt. For once, I was not the one bending, not the one giving. Karma had a way of circling back. Around that same time, I got a text from Jasmine late one evening. It had a screenshot of Emily's profile. The caption read, "Starting over is harder than it looks," paired with a picture of an empty wine glass. Jasmine wrote beneath it, "She's spiraling. Be careful." A few nights later, my phone rang, Emily's name flashing. I debated letting it ring out, but something made me pick up. Her voice was shaky, thin. "Michael left," she blurted. "The company folded before it even launched, and he walked away. Mom and Dad don't know what to do." I leaned back in my chair, the old floor creaking under me. "I'm sorry to hear that, Emily," she sniffled. Then her tone hardened. "You don't sound surprised." I wasn't, but I didn't say that. Instead, I murmured, "You'll find your way." There was a long pause, and then she whispered, "Everyone thinks I had it all, and now I have nothing." Her voice cracked. "Meanwhile, you had everything and never said a word." The line went quiet. I could hear her breathing ragged, and then she hung up without another word. I set the phone down and stared at the wood grain on the table, the silence pressing in. For years I had carried the weight of being less than, and now Emily was carrying her own. The following Sunday I saw my parents' number light up. This time it was Dad. His voice was gruff, a little unsteady. "Things have been rough here, Claire. The house needs repairs, Emily's struggling, and we don't know how to handle it all." I closed my eyes, picturing him in his chair, shoulders sagging, the pride stripped out of his voice. I thought about Carter's advice, about the folder locked in my desk with the deed, and every record I had started keeping. When Dad paused, waiting, I said simply, "I can't fix this for you." He cleared his throat. "We thought maybe you could at least come by, see the furnace." I shook my head, though he couldn't see it. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." We sat in silence for a few beats before he said quietly, "You've changed." "No," I answered, my voice calm. I finally stopped giving away pieces of myself to people who never valued them. When the call ended, I sat there in the stillness, feeling something shift inside me. Not triumph, not spite. Just a steady kind of peace. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt, the sidewalks wet and shining under the streetlights. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold air brushing my face, and looked at the apple tree in the yard. Its branches were bare now, but I could imagine the buds that would come in spring. For the first time, I did not feel like I was waiting for my family to see me. I felt like I was finally seeing myself. By the time spring rolled into Columbus, the cold heaviness of winter had lifted from my chest. The shop was busier than ever, trucks lined up in the lot, and I found myself training 2 apprentices who reminded me of Michael all those years ago. They asked endless questions, their hands clumsy on the wrenches, but I had patience. Teaching them gave me a strange sense of purpose, like passing on a language that only a few people ever truly understood. One afternoon after class at the community college, where I had started volunteering to teach financial basics, a young woman stayed behind. She looked nervous, her notebook clutched tight. She told me she had grown up like me, working long shifts, never feeling like she belonged anywhere. She said she wanted to learn how to make money work for her instead of chasing approval she would never get. I felt my throat tighten as I told her she already had what she needed: steady hands, discipline, and the willingness to keep showing up. Her eyes lit up, and in that moment, I knew I had carved something new out of the pain I used to carry. At home, the apple tree in my yard had started budding, small green leaves unfolding like promises. Jasmine stopped by most evenings with coffee or donuts, teasing me about working too much, reminding me to enjoy what I had built. We sat on the porch, the sun sinking low, the smell of spring damp in the air. Sometimes she would ask about my parents if they had reached out again. I always shook my head. A card had come on my birthday, signed only with their names, no message inside. It sat in a drawer unopened after that first glance. Emily had not called again. I knew bits and pieces through the grapevine. She was trying to find her footing, bouncing between ideas, no longer with Michael. I wished her well in silence, but I did not reach out. The distance was not revenge, it was survival. One Sunday evening, I found myself at the community center again, watching a group of women in work boots and hoodies gather around, as I explained how dividends worked, how small choices added up to freedom. Their laughter filled the room when I told them how I had once skipped buying boots to buy my first share. I laughed with them, remembering the girl I used to be, scared and unseen but stubborn enough to try anyway. When the workshop ended, one of the women slipped me a folded note. Later that night, in the quiet of my kitchen, I opened it. It said simply, "Thank you for showing me that worth is not given by family or titles. Worth is built, and you proved it can be done." I held the note for a long time, tears prickling my eyes, and then I tucked it into the same folder where I kept Carter's legal advice. Not as evidence of a battle, but as proof of a victory no one could take from me. As summer warmed the air, I spent more evenings on my porch, the apple tree growing fuller, the smell of cut grass in the neighborhood reminding me of simpler times. I thought back to Mom's words on that cold New Year's morning. "This place isn't for losers." I let the phrase roll around in my mind, but it no longer cut. It sounded small, almost pitiful compared to the life I was living. I had a house I repaired with my own hands, investments that grew quietly in the background, work that mattered. Students who looked at me like I carried answers. Friends who never once asked me to be anything other than myself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses, Jasmine leaned back in her chair and said, "You know, you finally look at peace." I smiled, sipping my coffee, the warmth filling me. "I am at peace," I answered. "I am not a loser." And for the first time, I did not need anyone else to say it. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or told you were not enough, I would love to hear how you found your strength. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if you have faced something similar. And if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and stay with me here. Your support means more than you know.